Good afternoon. Welcome to the University of Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs, Washington office. My name is Maura Policelli, and it is my pleasure to be hosting you this afternoon. It is delightful to be with an in-studio live audience again after so many months of virtual policy discussions, especially for a discussion around one of the most provocative and enduring policy topics in America, the intersection of religion and politics. Thankfully, we are also remaining connected far beyond the Beltway by simultaneously hosting many of you on Zoom, so welcome to all of you as well. Today's event is sponsored by the Francis and Catherine Rooney Center for the Study of American Democracy, with the support of the Keough School and our Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion. We are honored to have three distinguished scholars with us to present an overview of their book, Secular Surge, A New Fault Line in American Politics. David Campbell, Packy J.D. Professor of American Democracy at the University of Notre Dame. John Green, Director of the Ray C. Bliss Institute for Applied Politics at the University of Akron. And Geoffrey Layman, Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. Following their presentation, our authors will be joined by two esteemed panelists for a discussion regarding the implications of a secular surge on American politics. Rachel Deitch, who is the Policy and Social Justice Director at the American Humanist Association, and Emma Green, staff writer at The Atlantic. Now I would like to turn the podium over to my colleague, the I.A. O'Shaughnessy Dean of Notre Dame's College of Arts and Letters, Sarah Mastillo.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the students. Welcome to our distinguished guests. Welcome to our scholars. We are thrilled to be here hosting an event off campus, in person. This is an exciting moment for all of us. And even better if my papers are right side up. So welcome to everyone who's here and everyone who's on Zoom, and especially warm welcome to Francis Rooney. I echo Maura's gratitude to the Rooney family for their establishment of the Rooney Center and for their support of this inaugural lecture series. The Rooney Center for the Study of American Democracy is an extraordinary resource to support our ability as a university and as a college in having a distinct voice in the study of American politics. Academic freedom is of great importance in academia more generally, but at Notre Dame in particular. At Notre Dame, the world's preeminent Catholic research university, we seek perhaps a greater sense of academic freedom by not only allowing, but welcoming the topics of religion and faith into our teaching and research. The university's mission encourages our faculty and students to engage in issues of our time, to study and address the world's problems. We believe in the power Notre Dame has to form the leaders the world needs for tomorrow. The university's participation in the study of American politics is all the more important given some of the findings in the book we will discuss today, Secular Surge, in which the authors point out that an amorphous group of secularists is gaining in the US population and in political spheres. We need to grow our capacity as a university to host conversations and lectures like today's event, to continue to responsibly contribute to the marketplace of politics and political ideas in DC and beyond, through the shared expertise of faculty scholarship in the social sciences, the humanities, and the arts. Indeed, Notre Dame seeks to play an impactful role, to have a formative voice in the conversations about political life so central to our health as a nation. And the Rooney Center continues to provide us with extraordinary momentum, better enabling us to serve the common good by forming future leaders of our communities, religious bodies, and the nation. Further, Notre Dame continues to hire and support a remarkable group of colleagues in American politics and constitutional studies, some of whom are with us this afternoon. We are confident that this group of scholars will allow us to advance a premier center for the study of American politics in all facets, with particular attention to the vision, issues, and concerns stemming from Notre Dame's distinctive Catholic mission. I can conclude my brief introductory remarks with gratitude to Francis and Kathleen, who could not be here today, generous patrons, and thoughtful counselors who provide unwavering support to enhance the intellectual life for our students and to enhance the quality of the national conversation on American politics. Thank you, Francis. I now invite David Campbell, Geoffrey Layman, and John Green to lead us through a stimulating and thought-provoking conversation. Thank you all for being here today.
Well, thank you, Dean Mastillo, and everyone else involved in this event, both here in the room and out there in Zoom land. My name is Dave Campbell, and among other things, I teach political science. And today, we're going to talk about the book, the cover of which you see on the screen, Secular Surge. If you remember nothing else from today's remarks, please remember the title of the book and that it makes a wonderful Christmas, wedding, bar mitzvah, anniversary gift. Don't just buy one, buy a dozen. Slightly more seriously, I want to focus on why the book is titled Secular Surge. What do we mean by a surge? Well, this picture hopefully gives you a sense of why we use the word surge to describe what is happening with secularism, and I'll define that in just a moment. This is a graph that shows you a trend that I'm guessing many of you are already familiar with, because I think it's sort of out there in the ether, and that is the fact that we've seen over the last 20, 25, 30 years or so a rather stunning growth in the number of Americans who say they have no religious affiliation, who are loosely referred to as the nuns, because when asked, what is your religious affiliation, they will answer, none. I don't have one. This graph shows you, based on a big scientific sample of the American population over many years, what's been happening with the percentage of Americans who say they have no religious affiliation, who are nuns, who report never attending worship services, and who report that they do not believe in God. And you can see that all three of those lines are going up. But, and this is important, they are not the same thing. So there are many people who say they have no religion, but believe it or not, still attend religious services. They just don't consider themselves a member or an affiliate of that organized religion. There are many people who say they have no religion, but nonetheless still believe in God, or they have some sort of belief in an afterlife, or something approaching a deity. And then, of course, there are people who simply do not participate in religion at all, and who do not believe in a God. If you take nothing else from that picture, note that those lines are going up, and that when trying to understand the non-religious population in America, the story is complicated. And typically, whenever you might read about this trend, all of these folks are grouped together in one category, as though they are one and the same. And they are not. Indeed, one of the fundamental arguments, hopefully insights, of our book is a distinction between what we call the non-religious and the secular. And those might sound like they're the same, but they are not. To be non-religious is to be defined by what you are not. You are someone who does not attend religious services. You're someone who does not have a religious affiliation. But to be secular means you are defined by what you are. And the way we define that term, it refers to people who have an affirmative embrace of what we call a secular worldview. They see the world through a secular lens. But critically, and this is absolutely important to understanding what we are trying to say in this book, it is possible, we argue, for someone to have a secular worldview and yet nonetheless still be religious. And if that blows your mind, let me just pause and repeat that. It is possible for someone to be what we call a religious secularist. Now, if that seems like sort of a crazy category, let me just suggest to you that there are more of these folks out there than you might think. They're often found in mainline Protestant churches. Many American Jews fall into this category. Indeed, many Catholics do as well. Far fewer black Protestants, far fewer Mormons, far fewer white evangelical Christians. Now, the reason why that's important is it'll help us map out the whole non-religious and secular population. Now, one of the main things that we're doing in this book is tapping into this measurement of secularism. To measure non-religion is actually not that hard. It just means you take all our measures of religion that we've been using forever and just flip them around. But to measure secularism, this was something new. And so we actually had to develop measures. How do we figure out who these people are? And we did it, a variety of ways, one of which is we actually went out and talked to people. Through qualitative interviews, we sort of heard what they said and tried to match that up with ways that we could ask people on a systematic survey about their beliefs. But we also surveyed members of the American Humanist Association to test out the measures that we developed of secularism. And why the American Humanist Association? Well, because these are people that we know already have these secular beliefs. They belong to an organization that has grouped them together. And so we sort of view the American Humanist Association as our way of testing our measures. And I won't go into a lot of detail about this, but we have a set of secular beliefs that we ask people about. Do you agree or disagree with these statements? And in every single case, when we ask people about these beliefs, we find that the American Humanist Association members score very highly, which suggests to us that we are tapping into something that in any kind of common sense definition would be secularism. That's the blue bars on the chart here. The red bars are those same beliefs, but within the general population. So two things to take from here. American humanists tell us, yes, these are really measures of secularism. The other bars, the red ones, tell us that actually a fair number of just rank and file Americans out there hold these beliefs. And if you're wondering what these beliefs are, again, for the sake of time, I won't go through all of them, but they include statements like, the great works of philosophy and science are the best source of truth, wisdom, and ethics. Another one is, to understand the world, we must free our mind from old traditions and beliefs. Now, armed with our measurement of secularism on the one hand and non-religion on the other hand, it enables us to do every political scientist's dream, and that is create a 2x2 table. I can drop the mic right now, folks, because that's all you have to do in my business to make your name. A 2x2 table, by which I mean it's possible to be high in secularism and high in religiosity. That means you're a religious secularist. You could be high in religiosity but low in secularism. That means you're a religious person, or what we would call a religionist, and categories in between. So I could give you a lot of data, and you're going to get more of that in a few minutes, but let me just show you some pictures that hopefully illustrate the four categories that we have when we're describing the American population. These pictures will show you what these folks in each of these categories would be doing on a Sunday morning. The first, the religionists, I think that's pretty intuitive. These are folks in a church. This is probably an evangelical church, perhaps maybe a charismatic Catholic church. So that's where they are on Sunday mornings. Then we have a group that are the non-religionists. So they're high in non-religiosity, but they don't have that secular worldview. And what are these people doing on a Sunday morning? Well, they're watching football. Now, we recently did a panel like this, and Ross Douthat from the New York Times, he actually questioned whether or not this was an accurate photo, because he said, who would be watching football on a Sunday morning? Because football games are played, of course, in the afternoon. To which we pointed out that is a classic case of East Coast bias. Clearly, this is somebody in California watching a game on the East Coast. Our next group are the secularists. So these are people who are high in secularism. Okay? They're also high in non-religiosity. And where would they be found on a Sunday morning? Well, that's a little trickier, right? They're not going to be gathered together in a congregation, probably. But maybe they're out for brunch, talking about the latest New Yorker article, or what they saw.
The Atlantic.
Or the Atlantic, reading Emma Green's articles. And who are these religious secularists? Well, these are the folks who, as we said, have a secular worldview, but are nonetheless still found in a religious community. They also might be found in church, but a different kind of church. So this is probably an Episcopalian church, maybe a Unitarian Universalist church. But it's a reminder that it is possible for people to combine a secular worldview and religion in their lives. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, John Green, to tell us a little bit more about these folks.
Thank you, Dave. One of the most interesting things about these actually fairly crude categories that Dave has described is that they actually matter in describing American society and American politics. That's the other great dream of social scientists. Fourfold diagrams are mandatory, but if they actually explain things, that's the gold standard. So one of the things that, Dave, could you click to the next one? One of the things that these fourfold categories help us do is to unravel the complexity of the American religious landscape, including, of course, people who are non-religious or secular. I'm sure many of you have heard the common observation that the United States is one of the most religious societies among the advanced industrial societies in the world, and that is true. But it's a little bit more complicated than that simple statement would suggest. So you can look at this chart. It shows the relative size in our surveys of the four different groups that Dave just described. And we'll start on the far left with the religionists, a very diverse group because there's all kinds of religionists in the United States. And the religionists make up almost 2/5 of the adult population in the United States. Well, next, the secularists, the other group that Dave described, who were out to brunch on a Sunday morning, they make up, in our data, a little more than a quarter of the adult population. The next group on the chart, as you move over towards the right, are the non-religionists, and they make up a little less than a fifth of the adult population. And then finally, the fascinating category of religious secularists, approximately a sixth of the population. If you were to put the religionists and the religious secularists together, you would have a majority of American adults. But if you were to put the secularists and the non-religious together, you would have almost the same number of people. So this gives us, I think, a way to look at the complexity of American society in these terms. Well, what about their impact on politics? Do our measures, do our groups differentiate between the political views that people do? And they do. Just spoiler alert. But here, and this is a fairly complicated set of bar charts. The clusters of bars are different political measures. Over on the far left is ideology, in this case, a liberal ideology. The next cluster in is democratic partisanship. Then the next two are first economic liberalism, that is liberal views on economic issues. The one farther to the right is liberal views on cultural issues. And finally, the 2016 presidential vote, the vote for Hillary Clinton. In each of those clusters of four bars, notice the tallest bar. It's the farthest one on the right, the one that's blue. Secularism, secularists, are, among all these groups, the most liberal in ideology, the most democratic in their partisanship. They're also liberal on economic issues, cultural issues, and they voted strongly for Hillary Clinton. But if you look back a couple of bars farther to the left in each of these clusters, you'll see a white bar or a light gray bar. Those are the non-religionists. Notice that on balance, they tend to be fairly liberal, fairly democratic, and so forth, but at a much, much lower rate than the secularists. And what that tells us is that secularism, an affirmative embrace of a secular worldview, has a much more dramatic impact on politics than merely not being religious. Or as Dave put it, secularists are defined by what they are, and what they are matters on a lot of important political issues. Non-religionists are defined by what they're not, and the impact is much, much less. If you look over on the far left side of each of those clusters of bars, you'll see a red bar. Those are the religionists. Now, these bars don't tell us that religionists are all right-wing. It just says that religionists are less liberal and democratic and were less likely to vote for Hillary Clinton than the other groups that we've developed here. But also notice the religious secularists. On all of these measures, they fall between the non-religionists and the secularists, which is kind of an interesting and fascinating picture. These are political attitudes, but now we look at political behavior. It turns out that these groups, these measures, go a long way towards explaining the levels of civic activism in the United States, both political civic activity and non-political civic activity. And this chart just looks at one of those, which is voter turnout in the 2016 presidential election. The group that voted at the highest rate were the religionists. this should come at no surprise. We have a lot of data that suggests that people involved in religious communities and so forth tend to have very high levels of civic engagement. But look over to the far right. The secularists are nearly as close, nearly at the same level of voter turnout. But then look back to the gray or light blue, very light blue slide. The non-religionists, they're the group that voted the least. When people look at very simple measures of secularism or non-religiosity, they often conclude that secular people are civic slackers. Well, some of them are, but some of them aren't. And this is a place where the distinction between secularism and non-religiosity turns out to be a very powerful thing. And now I'd like to turn our presentation over to Jeff Layman to talk a little bit about party politics.
Do you want this slide first?
Yeah. Okay, thanks a lot, John. I'm going to bring us home by talking about what are the consequences of this secular surge for party politics, because that's what we all care about in Washington, right? Who's going to win and who's going to lose because of this secular surge? I can't actually answer that, but I will talk about what does this mean for party politics. And what it means, the bottom line, is that the secular surge has the potential to create quite a significant secular religious divide between the parties, but it also has the potential to create a secular religious divide within the parties. So what you're looking at here are data from our own 2017 mass survey of the entire electorate. And so mass identifiers are just ordinary men and women who call themselves Democrats or Republicans. And then a survey that we did of delegates to the 2016 Republican and Democratic national conventions. And the thing that stands out immediately is there's a substantial divide between the parties. The dominant group in the Republican Party is clearly religionists, and that's especially the case among Republican National Convention delegates. The ascendant group, on the other hand, in the Democratic Party are secularists, so a clear secular religious divide between the parties. On the other hand, it's not so simple that this is party polarization, inter-party polarization. There's also the potential for a divide within the parties, and particularly within the Democratic Party. If you're looking at the Democratic graph here, you see secularists are the largest group, but religionists and non-religionists are also substantial portions of the Democratic coalition. And in our book, we show that religionists or religionist Democrats are disproportionately people of color. Non-religionist Democrats are disproportionately non-college educated whites. So as the Democratic Party attempts to do three things simultaneously, mobilize their secularist base, continue to do very well among people of color, and also have some appeal, at least, to the white working class, they have to confront this potential for a divide within the Democratic Party between secularists, religionists, and non-religionists. Next slide, please, Dave. And you can see this play out in terms of Democratic Party preferences for their party's presidential nominee. This is 2016. Now we're looking at state-level Democratic delegates. And of course, in 2016, Bernie Sanders represented the left wing of the Democratic Party. Hillary Clinton at least positioned herself as more moderate. And so it's not surprising that religionists within the Democratic Party were significantly more likely to prefer Hillary Clinton. Secularists, on the other hand, were more likely to prefer Bernie Sanders as the presidential nominee. And so the secular religious divide had consequences for intra-party Democratic politics in 2016, and it continues to have those consequences today. You might think, well, what does the Republican Party have to do with this? There's no secularists within the Republican Party. That's an oversimplification, but there's not a lot. So how could there be a divide within the GOP? Well, there's not a secular religious divide, but there is at least, as the non-religious proportion of the American population grows, the nones, there is the potential for a non-religionist versus religionist divide, particularly as Donald Trump and his brand of politics remain prominent, dominant in today's Republican Party, because it seems that Trump and Trumpism, by which I mean things like restrictionist immigration policies, protectionist trade policies, a relatively confrontational stance toward some racial and religious minority groups, that seems to have a particular appeal for non-religionists who identify themselves as Republicans. And this is just a bit of evidence for this. This is a survey from January 2016, when at least there was the potential for Donald Trump to become the Republican presidential nominee, but it was not yet obvious that that would happen. And so we still have a lot of candidates in the race, and we have grouped them into 4 categories. One is Trump, a category unto himself, which I believe he would like. The Christian conservatives, Ted Cruz and Ben Carson may have best personified that group. The more moderate, established Republicans like Jeb Bush, John Kasich, perhaps Marco Rubio, and then other Republicans. And you can see that Donald Trump was the plurality choice of both religionists and non-religionists. However, far more so for the non-religionists. A near majority of non-religionist Republicans at that point supported Trump, and it's just a slight plurality supporting Trump among the religionists. And so as the non-religious proportion of the American population grows, while there may not be a secular religious divide within the Republican Party, we may see tensions between non-religionists and religionists within the Republican Party. Yeah. And just to sum up, there are a couple takeaways from what we have presented today. More takeaways, we hope, from the book, but what we've talked about. One, as Dave said, if you remember nothing else, it's that all secular people are not alike. Some people that we throw into that non-religious or group of nones are truly committed secularists, while others are simply non-religionists, and there are clear political differences between those groups. Differences in political participation, in policy positions, and in party loyalties. The second thing is that there is a secular religious divide that is becoming embedded in American party politics. There's a clear divide between the parties, with secularists ascendant in the Democratic Party and religionists being the dominant group in the Republican Party. But there's also at least the potential for a consequential divide within the parties. Secularists versus religionists already is consequential within the Democratic Party, and perhaps there is emerging a religionist versus non-religionist divide, or if not divide, at least perhaps tensions within the Republican Party. So with that, we will call it a day for us, and we will move on to our commentators.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen, for your presentation. Fantastic. We're now going to have Rachel and Emma join us for a panel discussion, and then engage as many of you as we can fit in the time allotted. As we make this transition, Dave, one follow-up question to your presentation. In your book, there is a lot of analysis, too much to possibly have you summarize in an answer to this question, but the question of, does secularism influence politics or politics influence secularism? And you all do a fascinating deep dive on that in the book, but can you tease that out for us a little bit now, and then we'll
Sure.
bring Emma and Rachel in?
So most people, including political scientists, would assume that the world works like this. People have a religious or a secular belief, worldview, and that is what influences their politics. In fact, anytime you utter a sentence like, the percentage of evangelical Christians who voted for Donald Trump was blank, it implies that in that sentence, it's being an evangelical that leads you to vote for Donald Trump. Well, it turns out there's a lot of evidence that the relationship can actually go the other way. That it's not just that your religion or your secularism affects your politics, but that your politics can affect whether or not you are religious or secular. It totally reverses the way we've understood this. Now, in the book, we go into a lot of detail to try to test that out. Now, I should also say that we are not the first to make this claim, although I'd like to think that we are among a small group that have brought the heavy guns to this question. Okay, we settled it. No. We don't realize that in political science, them's fighting words. One of the ways we do this is we look at surveys of the same people over time and see what's more likely to change, their politics or their religion. And it turns out that in many cases, it's the politics that stays fixed, and that in turn leads to a change in either their religion or their secularism. Believe it or not, we also do this with experiments, which makes it sound like we're putting people in a laboratory and injecting them with secularism or religion. It's not quite like that. Instead, we take people and we randomly assign them to read different news stories, perhaps about the mixture of religion and politics, and we see whether or not in a short-term, controlled setting, does that change, at least for a brief time, their tendency to identify with a religion. And it turns out when people read about the religious right, many people, particularly Democrats, they move away from having a religious affiliation. And there are, like I said, a variety of other ways that we've tested that, but I think it's fair to say that we've triangulated on that question and settled, not that it always goes from politics to religion, but that the relationship can go both ways, and that in and of itself is new. It is really a different way to think about the way these two things interact.
Great, thank you. So Rachel, representing the American Humanist Association, which was studied, examined extensively in this book, what was your reaction to the book and the topic of secularism as you see it from the AHA perspective?
Yeah, so first I want to thank you for having me here today. And second, I want to commend the authors on the work presented in this book, the data collection, the findings, the presentation of it does for our community what we have been asking for years. We have always thought that we are distinct from the nuns, that we shouldn't be looped into a catch-all category, and this affirms that. It gives me the evidence I need to demonstrate to our folks that we are politically active in the ways we thought we were. We reflect the values we thought we did. So as an evidence-based organization, we're really grateful to the authors for putting it together and publishing it. I want to uplift a few recommendations that y'all make in your conclusion that I think help bridge the fault line and work toward the kind of world that at the American Humanist Association we're trying to do. The first is to build coalitions. You recognize that there are a lot more that bring us together, or the authors recognize that there's a lot more that bring us together as religionists or secularists. And when we drill down into policy, that's where you find common ground. And throughout the course of the book, when we're talking about fault lines, I kept thinking, well, what about underlying policy? What about underlying policy? The things that really drive folks to action in many ways. And I think they're absolutely right that there is a lot that when we focus on the policy and we focus on, helping reduce poverty in this country, that there's a lot that we can work together on. The second piece is building coalitions to emphasize free exercise of religion. It's something that secularists really firmly believe. That, within the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause really need to be preserved in this country, and that's something that I think we align really well with. And I think because of the important role I anticipate, or at least I hope this book will play in the future studies of our community, I do want to also offer a small critique, and I will say it's semantic, which might elicit some groans. And it's not unique to the authors of this book, I think, in any way. The last paragraph begins that the United States has always had a highly secular state, and I couldn't agree with that more. Right, secularism is the separation of religion from government from religion. But as you outline early in the book, the word secular is mostly used very differently. It frames individuals as secular, right? As a humanist atheist, I am categorized as a secular human, which the American Humanist Association has moved away from in the last 10 years. We don't identify ourselves individuals as secular. I'm not my own government, so how could I be secular? And I think that the findings support this shift. Only 4% of the American Humanist Association members surveyed use the term secular as their primary identifier. And in qualitative interviews outlined in the book, I didn't really see any mention of the word secular. And I think that, I'll be the first to admit that my community cannot seem to figure out how to identify ourselves. But there's a lot of work being done, when I have my monthly meetings with the Freedom from Religion Foundation, with the Secular Coalition for America, we are constantly talking about what to refer to ourselves as. But while the book has empirical aims, I think the use of this word is normative, whether it wants to be or not. And that's damaging because it reduces our community to what ought to be a political principle of how we organize government. It posits religionists against secularists, which really isn't the case. 66% of Americans strongly believe in the separation of religion and government. And when we reduce secularism down to a population of atheists, which the book makes very clear are not trusted in this country, it changes what we understand as secularism in this country. And so, folks in my community are concerned that there's a decline of secularism, a decline in the separation of religion and government. Whereas, from the title of the book, Secular Surge, that isn't totally clear. But that is to say, semantics aside, the information in this book is absolutely useful, and I really do hope it becomes a foundation for studies going forward.
I'll just quickly say, I take your point. In fact, as we were discussing before we came on stage today, we agonized over the right language to use to describe these various categories because we're coming up with them, right? We got to come up with our own terms, and I could show you from our notes over many years. We've cycled through many options. But we needed one that started with the letter S because we wanted to go with search. No, I'm kidding. That's not what we wanted. However, what Rachel's describing, this idea that secularism has the meaning of the separation of church and state, in the book, we refer to that as public secularism. And maybe that's not satisfactory, but I hope at the very least that signals that we're not blind to that as one understanding of it. But we do go further because we do want to actually make the point that one does not have to be secular as we define it, that is not religious, in order to agree with the separation of church and state, as Rachel has noted. There are actually many religious people that also take a very firm view that there ought to be a high wall of separation, as it's often put.
So Emma, it's wonderful to have you with us.
Thanks so much.
From your extensive interviews that you do around the country and your coverage of religion and politics in America, how does the book ring true for you in terms of these different categories and the alignment with politics based on how the authors have positioned non-religionists and secularists?
Well, I don't know if any of you heard about this, but there was a huge election last fall. And I was out in the field, like so many other politics reporters, trying to understand how Americans were thinking about this pivotal moment. And I ended up at an oversized shelter in a park in Cobb County, Georgia, which is just north of Atlanta. For those of you who are students of political history, you might recognize Cobb County as the place where Newt Gingrich launched his career. Sean Hannity got his start there as a conservative radio host. It has been consistently one of the conservative strongholds of Georgia, this sort of ring suburb of Atlanta. And I was there to meet with a group of women on a Sunday morning who had decided to use their free time to canvass for a woman named Jen Jordan, who is this short, blonde, very Southern lawyer who recently became a state legislator. Jen Jordan basically became famous or came into prominence not only as a Democrat who was elected from this county, from the suburbs of Atlanta, but also as someone who really took a stand on the way that legislators in Georgia were talking about the issue of abortion. And she shared her experiences with miscarriage and stillbirth, and really sort of brought a visceral story that I think animated a lot of the women who were there wanting to canvass on her behalf. The reason I'm telling you this story, and what was so striking to me about this story, was that a lot of these were middle-aged white women who had never, ever, ever participated in politics in any form before. They had been activated by the 2016 election. They got involved, some of them during the midterm cycle in 2018. They were very involved by the time 2020 rolled around. And they spoke to me about why they were there in the language of identity. They were talking about how important the values of this election were, how they had found Jen as a kind of vehicle for a broader referendum on what they hated about what was happening in the country. These were Democrats. So, why is that story relevant to the secular surge? Two things about the book really stuck out to me, thinking back on that reporting experience that I had. The first was the fact that this was an identity formed in opposition. One of the things that the authors point out is that a driver of the secular surge, or a rise in the sort of coalescing of this identity, is a sense that people don't want to be evangelical. They feel opposed to the religious right. They're alienated by their sense of the role of conservative religious influence in American politics. And so I think it really is borne out in reporting and the anecdotes that I've run across, the stories that I've written about this particular group, that identity in opposition, the sense that my political energy is coming from trying to oppose that, really, it's quite true. And I don't know if you would call that secularism exactly, but that phenomenon, I think, is really powerful and quite descriptive for what we've experienced in the 2020 and 2016 election cycles. The other thing that I found really interesting and novel about the book, and again applies to these women at the shelter at the park in Cobb County, Georgia, is this idea that there are some people who go to church and have a long history of religious identification in their family, who they themselves might identify as secular or be described accurately as secular. Maybe they have beliefs that are vaguely spiritual. They go to church because it's a ritual with their family, or they're more Christmas and Easter type of people. That was a lot of the women that I was encountering who were activated on that Sunday morning. But I think this is a really important intervention because, as the three scholars pointed out when they were on stage, I think sometimes we get misled by data when we just think about religion versus not religion as the correct categories, rather than separating out a group of people who may affiliate with a church or may describe themselves as having a religious heritage they care about, but actually have attitudes and mentalities that are much more similar to their secular peers who don't have any religion at all. So I found that really useful and clarifying for my own lens, and I really do think that some of the frames in this book resonate with what I've been seeing out in the field.
And also, I read your interview of Cornell West, and if you could just share a little bit about that conversation and how, from what I read, he really did take a hard look at, with your prompting, the difference between the liberal left of the Democratic Party and those who consider themselves religious in the Democratic Party, and kind of the tensions there about who actually had the moral, who truly was the speaking with a moral and courageous value-based politics, and who may not be. So if you could just share a little bit of that. It was for those who didn't have a chance to read it.
Sure. Well, you should all go back and read it, obviously. Read everything that I write, www.theatlantic.com. Cornell West, if you have never had the pleasure of being able to speak with him or see one of his lectures, is someone who has a flair for words and perhaps a penchant for hyperbole, or at least an illustrative metaphor. He and I were talking about this very issue, about the role of faith on the left in the Democratic Party. He is someone who has charted his career, his scholarly career, trying to bring together what he sees as leftist socialist values and a faith that he cares very much about, that he has a very strong inheritance in history and association with. And, we were talking about the current iterations of the Democratic Socialists of America. And as we got to talking, I thought, you know what? It kind of sounds like you're saying that Jesus would be much more at home today at a DSA meeting than he would be in most evangelical churches. And Cornell West was like, yes, absolutely. The Democratic Socialists of America have it nailed. What I thought was so interesting about that is if you visit a DSA meeting, if you hang out with the people in Brooklyn who consider themselves to be part of that vanguard, many, many, many of them would not claim any sort of traditional religious affiliation. They probably wouldn't say that they have any kind of personal connection or inspiration from Jesus. These would not be people who you traditionally describe as having religious values in any way. I think what he was putting his finger on was the fact that there's a difference, or you could actually call out a difference, between being someone who goes to church and goes through the motions of religiosity that we typically identify in political science work or in journalism, and people who align themselves with a certain set of values that he is saying are the values that he sees in the Bible. So I thought that was a really interesting inversion, because again, like the book describes, it sort of turns on its head the normal categories that we use to slice up the population: who's religious, who's not, who's secular, who's not. On one count, all of those people he's meeting with at the DSA meetings are pretty secular by any accounting. But he's also seeing, interestingly and perhaps ironically, reflected in their actions and their priorities, what he sees as religious values. So again, I think that really raises this question of the religious secularists as an interesting category that deserves more exploration, because it upends our expectations.
And so I've got a question for David and Rachel. I'll just ask at the same time. So David, in the Republican Party, what are the policies or values, or both, that the non-religionists hold in the Republican Party from your studies? And Rachel, in terms of values and policies, what are the leading issues that not just the AHA, American Humanist Association, but other organizations that you partner with and your coalitions that you are working to build? What are the issues that bring you all together? Just so we can get to the values and policies part of this conversation, what Americans care about, whatever category our authors have put them in their book, what are the driving issues that, from your various vantage points, you see Americans focused on? If you want to start, David.
I should say that I'm one of the three authors on the stage, which is strictly a matter of real estate. And I guess I lost the game of paper, rock, scissors, so I'm the one up here. But I'm going to just give you a very brief answer, and then Jeff, if it's okay, I'm going to throw it over to you, because Jeff's our party guy. And John, of course, if you want to weigh in, by all means do so. So what you asked me was, what do the non-religionists want? And the short answer to that is, we don't really know. And I'm not sure they really know, because this is not a group that has sharply defined beliefs and attitudes. And that's what makes them different than the secularists, where they are more likely, with apologies, Rachel, who are more likely to have a clearly defined ideology. So with that sort of teaser, Jeff, do you want to say a little bit more on that theme?
Sure. This isn't on. Is this on? Okay. Thanks, Dave. Well, I think Dave is correct in some sense that non-religionists writ large, it's very hard to say what their distinct policy perspectives are. In the book and the charts that we were showing before, we kind of break it down into non-religionist Republicans, or at least, in surveys, people who say I'm an independent, but I lean Republicans, who are likely to perhaps vote in a Republican or vote in a Republican primary. For them, I think they are less interested in the cultural conservatism of the Republican Party, pro-life on abortion, traditional family values. But what attracts them to Donald Trump in particular, I think, is they're concerned about immigration. They would like to see more restrictionist immigration policies. They feel that the traditional free trade agenda of traditional conservatism and the Republican Party has left them behind, perhaps. And they're, they are, trying to put this nicely, they are not too keen on diversity and multiculturalism. And so I think they find at least Donald Trump's brand of politics particularly appealing. The question is, does that emerge from their non-religion, or does it emerge from their socio-demographic profile as tending to be non-college educated whites? And probably a bit of both. They're attracted to perhaps the Trump agenda without feeling particularly enamored with the Republican Party's traditional focus on religion and religious conservatism. So they might have found some of the policies of, say, a George W. Bush to be appealing, but they wouldn't necessarily have found President Bush's overt religiosity appealing. So I think it's amorphous, but I think there is a group of Republicans who are not terribly religious, but find Donald Trump and Trumpism appealing. And I'll just say one more thing. When we first heard about, well, why are evangelical Christians supporting Donald Trump, who is not an evangelical, is not particularly religious himself, so strongly in the early part of the Republican primary season, it was actually the less devout evangelicals. We may end up coding those people as non-religionists. They identify as evangelical, they identify as a Baptist or perhaps Church of God or something like that, but they're not really attending. They are not really practicing religion, and those people tended to find Donald Trump quite attractive.
Thank you, Jeff. So, Rachel.
Yeah. So first, Dave, you do not need to apologize. Semantics aside, I do want to uplift something that's in the book that hasn't been addressed, which is when we talk about nuns, we're not talking about necessarily non-believers. We're talking about folks who don't identify with organized religion, right? So they might have a faith in God. And that is just such a large bucket of people. And really, just to reiterate again, my gratitude for this study, that it really identifies that, yes, humanists in particular, which I love that you were able to use our organization, humanists, 34% have been to a rally in the last year. We vote in elections, we organize, we are delegates, which one thing as a sidebar I'd love to ask the authors, Dave, is do you think there was a Bernie bump? Because at the end of the book you talk about Bernie, and his secular leanings. I wouldn't say he's an atheist, but his secular leanings, if you were to do that study again, is there a way to parse that out, and particularly when it comes to delegates? But to answer your question, the American Humanist Association has been around since 1941. We have a lot of stances on a lot of issues, and in the same way that Unitarian Universalists and Catholics have taken positions on every issue under the sun, so too have the humanists. And so my policy portfolio is incredibly broad, and I wouldn't be able to do anything that I do if I didn't work in coalition. So every issue we work on, from voting rights to abortion to preserving the Johnson Amendment, is all done in coalition with not just secular groups, but also with religious groups. And if I ever were to attempt to start working on an issue and there wasn't a religious group involved in some way, that would really, to me, be a cause for concern, because at the end of the day, it does come down to common values. And if I don't have common values with, religious organizations on a particular issue, then I have to rethink where I'm coming from.
Evan, did you want to jump in?
Well, this is sort of on a different point, but another thing that hasn't been lifted up, just to pick up where Rachel left off, is the role of race, which I found really fruitful as a discussion in the book. there's a great chart that's on the book, and if you haven't read Secular Surge yet, you'll see this when you buy your dozen or 50 copies that you'll give out to all of your family and friends.
And lots of charts.
Yes, many charts. But one I thought was particularly striking was a breakout of these categories of secularist and religious secularists, non-religious and religious, by race and class. So the categories were college-educated white, non-college educated white, Latino, and African American. And far and away, college-educated whites were the strongest proportion of secularists, and more than half of college-educated whites identified or could be identified as secularists. But even non-college educated whites had a much, much higher proportion who were non-religionists than either Latinos or African Americans. So clearly something that we see here is that white people are a big part of what we're describing when we're talking about the secular surge. I thought this was really relevant because I think it is an important lens for understanding splits in the Democratic Party. I thought it was an important lens for understanding generally, who's the face of this and who are we actually talking about when we talk about secularism and its role in politics. But one aspect that I wanted to lift up from my own reporting is that I don't think it tells the whole story. And I've been really interested in the diversity within communities of color in the way that religion, and specifically religious institutions, have power to drive political action. I wrote a story, a half dozen years ago about the Black Lives Matter movement and the role of the historic Black church in driving the kind of political activism that we saw after Freddie Gray, that we saw after all of these different police shootings, certainly that we saw last summer. And one of the things that I found, I reported this story out of Baltimore, which is why I brought up Freddie Gray. One of the things I found is that the historic Black church actually didn't have that much of a footprint in the Black Lives Matter movement, that a lot of the people who were in the streets, who were doing the organizing, who were creating organizations were young, religiously disaffiliated. Some of them had spiritual or religious beliefs. Some of them had a family that had gone to church or a family that had been part of a mosque. But really, very much in contradiction to the civil rights movement and how we think about that era and that activism, the historic Black church wasn't at the vanguard. And there were some pastors who were involved, and there were definitely some churches that took part, but they weren't the ones leading the way. People out in the streets were young and secular. So, I lift that up just to say, I think race is a really important piece of how we're understanding who is part of these different categories. And I also, just as a reporter, always try to keep in mind, even when we know the big trends, more than half of college-educated whites could be described as secular, that doesn't mean that there's not an interesting story within those other groups. And I think those divisions ultimately can be politically salient because the Black Lives Matter movement, who's driving that and shaping that, is a huge, huge question of our time.
Great. Well, we have time to take some questions from our students or others that are with us here in the room. And then also I'll pull up my handy-dandy iPad and grab some questions from those of you online. Feel free to submit them into the questions section of your webinar. And it looks like we have a question from this young lady. Please come up to the podium, and then we can, both folks at home can see you and we can all hear your question. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Kelly Harris. First of all, I wanted to thank you all for being here today, introducing us to your book, and hosting all of us students. My question, I think, is pretty timely, especially with the book. But yesterday there was an article published in the Irish Rover, which was considered extremely controversial and somewhat offensive. But it basically went over, and the author argued that if Notre Dame takes secular positions, that it cannot claim its Catholic identity. And seeing all the research that you guys put into the book, I was wondering, where does Notre Dame go from here as a university? How does it identify? Would it be religiously secular, or, yeah, I guess that's my question.
Well, I'm a Hoya, and so I am going to take the liberty of commentating on Notre Dame's Catholic identity. Great privilege of being a Georgetown grad. I think to a certain extent, Notre Dame probably faces some of the same tensions that a university like Georgetown does, although perhaps to a lesser degree for a number of reasons, which is that it's a Tier 1 research university that also has a distinctive Catholic identity. And I have seen in my reporting the way that that has played out on campus time and time again. All of you could rehearse this much better and with much more juicy gossip than I could. This came out on campus with the contraceptive mandate in the Affordable Care Act. Certainly, Notre Dame took a very public stance against the contraceptive mandate and was one of the plaintiffs in lawsuits against the Obama administration. But there were tons of campus protests, and I talked to graduate students who came to Notre Dame because it was the premier university for their topic of study for their PhD, and they also believed that the university owed it to them to have the ability to prescribe contraceptives as part of their healthcare plan. So, that's not any kind of forward normative prescription. And in fact, if Ahoya sat up here and tried to tell, people from Notre Dame what to do with your university, he'd probably boo me out of here. But, I just think that this is a fundamental tension to any kind of university that's trying to maintain those two identities at the same time. And it's interesting that Irish Rover article that you're pointing to pointed to, this sort of grad student category, the people who come for the research, not the Catholicism, as a secular stand or a secular point of view. I think that speaks to the power of this book as a kind of explanatory framework for understanding some of the tensions that we see within communities and cultures. How'd I do?
Well, I can just jump in for a second, because having done my homework for today's discussion, because I don't have this memorized, but I happen to have pulled up from Notre Dame's website a statement of Notre Dame's Catholic identity. And it says, quote, "Our nature as a Catholic university gives us cause to embody two important characteristics: a spirit of inclusion and welcoming of people from all faith traditions or no faith tradition, and an earnest desire to serve the local and global community." So I had, in looking at this, had a question I was going to toss our panel, and thanks to our students' question, maybe it is timely, but if Notre Dame, which I believe it is an example of a part of American society that is obviously rooted in faith, it is a Catholic university, and principles such as service to others is front and center of the university's mission, but also is inclusive and celebrates academic freedom. Is that something that can be replicated in America? Not that Notre Dame gets it perfectly, and it certainly can be a messy journey, I imagine. But there are some ingredients there, faith and inclusion and the value of service, which is not necessarily tied to any one religion or any religion. And that's an interesting mix that creates fascinating conversations, I'm sure, but is tricky. Is really tricky. Is it too delicate a dance? And I'm looking to you, David, to
first of all,
thread that needle.
I'm going to confess something here, which sort of seems appropriate, I guess, when we're talking about the Catholic character of Notre Dame. Ayo, a confession? Come on, guys. That's the best I've got. Dad jokes. That's it. I'm just going to confess. It turns out I don't actually read the Irish Rover on a regular basis, so this is not an article I've read.
Student journalism.
But that's not going to stop me from commenting, nonetheless. So here's my second confession. I'm not Catholic, and yet somehow for 19 years I have taught at the University of Notre Dame. And they even gave me an office last year and started paying me a few years ago. So, it sort of worked out well. No, I say that only in jest, but to reflect something that Mara was saying. Notre Dame is Catholic, as Father Jenkins often puts it, in two senses. Of course, it's Catholic in a capital C sense. It's a Roman Catholic institution. But it's Catholic in a small c sense in that it does welcome people from many different backgrounds. And I guess what I would say from my time at Notre Dame, whenever I hear these debates, which, go on eternally, it's never clear to me what the Catholic position is. Like, whenever I'm with a bunch of Catholics at Notre Dame, they never seem to agree on anything. So it's not clear to me what it means to say that Notre Dame speaks with a, quote, Catholic voice, because I think modern Catholicism is a diverse faith tradition. And I remember years ago, I was in a meeting with none other than Father John himself. And I was curious, as somebody who studies this sort of thing, but what was his definition of a Catholic? And he gave a very interesting response. And his response was, a Catholic is someone who comes and receives communion in the faith, period. And his point was that this is a big tent that encompasses a lot of different people from a lot of different places and with a lot of different views. I'm not sure where that comes down on the policy. You know, that's above my pay grade on particular positions the university might take on this side or the other. But I can say from the trenches, from the perspective of the faculty, I think there is an appreciation that the university is a place where, as Dean Mastillo said in her opening remarks, academic freedom is valued. And so therefore, there is a healthy, robust discussion about all sorts of things, which include, but is not limited to, things that we might say would be sort of informed by the Catholic faith. And as someone who is at the university but not in the faith, I find this absolutely fascinating. And I think it is a model for the rest of the country because it demonstrates that it is possible for people who share one thing to come together and talk about conflicting views on other things, and yet nonetheless walk out of the room recognizing that they all have something very important in common.
Another student question? Come up. It's wonderful that we have Notre Dame students here in Washington every semester.
Hi, my name is Rachel Stockford. Again, I just wanted to echo what Kelly said. Thank you to all the panelists and the authors who are here with us today. And thank you to the Rooney Center and also the Keough School for hosting this event. I was fortunate enough to take Professor Campbell and Professor Layman's class on the 2020 election last fall. So I was very excited to see the 2x2 chart back on the screen today. My question is probably best directed at Professor Layman, but is obviously open to any of the panelists. So you can correct me if I'm wrong, but according to some of your charts from the presentation, there are a higher percentage of religious secularists who identify as Republican compared to Democrats, both in voters and also convention delegates. But when looking at how these religious secularists vote, we noticed that in the Democratic primary, they were more likely to vote for Bernie Sanders as compared to Hillary Clinton. So I was just wondering if there is an explanation as to why there are maybe more religious secularists who identify on the right, but for those who do exist on the left, why they choose the more progressive candidate.
That's a fascinating question. Thank you for it. And much like the non-religionists, I think the religious secularists are a very diverse group because, as their names suggest, they are cross-pressured. They are pulled in two very different directions. And so I think, first of all, it may depend on which party they lean towards. If they are Democrats, that may mean that they're emphasizing their secularism and that the values that emerge from their secularism are what has defined their party loyalty. Therefore, they support Bernie over Hillary or perhaps more moderate Democrats. If they're Republicans, then I think they've chosen to prioritize their religious values and the religionist part. I suspect that religious secularists tend to be Republican for very similar reasons as religious people tend to be Republicans. They are, after all, religious, and so by and large, they have more traditional moral values. They have a more conventional view of the family and the structure of American society, and that's what pushes them in a more religious direction. I suspect in the Republican Party, religious secularists who by and large would be mainline Protestants, are going to be more, going to find more appealing candidates like President Bush, Jeb Bush, John Kasich, people who tend to be, at least from the more moderate wing of the Republican Party, than they would Donald Trump or perhaps Ted Cruz. I don't know if that answers your question. I'd like to say just one thing about the last question, if I might. I want to, this is sort of self-congratulatory. I have a piece coming out in Advances in Political Psychology, which I assume you all subscribe to and read. But it's on seamless garment Catholics and how they vote. And seamless garment Catholics, that's a term from Cardinal Bernardin, that means basically they support the whole cloth of Catholic social teaching as applied to politics. And I think in terms of that Irish Rover piece, I would get back to what Rachel said. Many of the teachings, much of Catholic social teaching would find much in agreement with humanism. And so to say, well, this is a secular position as opposed to a Catholic position, that's very difficult to sort out on a lot of political issues. And I think Notre Dame could be taking very Catholic positions on policy issues or on social issues more generally that are perfectly in keeping with Catholic social teaching, but also would seem very humanist. And so I think it's difficult to sort that out.
Thank you, Jeff. Any other students want to jump up to the podium right now? I'll give you all a second to come up with your next question, but I do have one that came in on Zoom from you folks at home that I thought might be a good one to share with the panel. Through the presentation of this book, it is right to say that both the religionists and secularists have more influence in determining who becomes the presidential candidate in both the Republican Party and Democratic Party. I'm sorry, is it right to say? So the question is it right to say that religionists and secularists really are the determining entities within the respective parties? Do you want to take that, David?
If I could, again, why don't I just give a brief answer? And John, who is our practical politics guy, is on the ground, could maybe also speak to this. Does that sound all right? The short answer would be yes. We know when we look at convention delegates, that's an important group, right? These are the people that are doing the shoe leather politicking. They're knocking on the doors, they're working the phones, that kind of thing. You are more likely to find, if you're on the Republican side, that it's a religionist who's doing that work. And if you're on the Democratic side, you're more likely to be a secularist. But as always, the story is a little more complicated than that, because in the case of the Democratic Party in particular, as we pointed out, there's a fair number of religionist folks in the Democratic column, and as Joe Biden demonstrated, if you want to win the Democratic nomination, that's a very important constituency to win over. John, is there more you want to add?
Perhaps for people in Washington, this goes without saying, but it's important to say nonetheless. American politics is a politics of coalition. Whether in the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, independents, it's all about building coalitions. And while it is certainly the case that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have a different basis of support, they have diversity within their coalitions, and in order to win elections and then to do the much messier, more difficult thing of governing, they have to be able to reach out to a broader group of people. So I think the insight behind the question, which is that all of the things being equal, religionists may have more influence in the Republican Party than non-religionists, and secularists may have more influence in the Democratic Party than other groups, all other things being equal. In politics, things are not always equal. And it's very important to be able to build broader coalitions. And one of the interesting problems we've had in the United States for at least the last 20 years is it's been extremely difficult to form coalitions, and it's become even more difficult. In some ways, our book points to some new impediments to coalition building. But as Rachel pointed out and Emma suggested, along with those impediments, there are also some extraordinary opportunities to get around the kind of impasses that we've been witnessing in terms of coalition building. So you begin the argument with different biases of support, but you end the argument by when you get to 50% or more of the people who are involved. So it's not just where you begin, it's where you end.
Thank you, John. Another question that we have is there a correlation between percentage of Americans with no I'm sorry, that one was not a complete question. Could the panelists please define what secularists believe and think? Understanding how you define secularism is key to this presentation. It's obviously several pages of the book that I don't know how quickly could be summed up, David, but if you want to give just kind of the
Sure.
summary of how you all defined it in the book, actual term secularism, and then if Rachel wants to add anything in terms of the beliefs and values part of the question.
So again, the exercise that we are engaged in here is trying to come up with a way of identifying a group of people who do not necessarily think of themselves as a group of people. So just simply asking, are you particularly a term like religious secularist is absurd, right? Like nobody goes around in their head thinking, I'm a religious secularist. In fact, as Rachel noted, very few people actually describe themselves by using the term secular either. Some would describe themselves as a humanist, some as an atheist. So we had to come up with some other way of figuring out who these people are. Now, I should also say, that's nothing new in social science. That's actually kind of the bread and butter of what a lot of social scientists do, is come up with ways of understanding how people see the world and applying perhaps labels and groupings to those, even if those people don't realize they're part of that group. So the way we do it with the secularists is we actually have 3 types of measures that we combine together. And when I say measure, again, that's a question asked of you on a survey. So we ask, for example, do any of these terms describe you? And we give them a long list. Some of them are religious, some of them are secular, and we find that 4 of them hang together. That is, people who choose one are likely to also choose another. And those 4 are atheist, agnostic, secular, and humanist. And so if you score one of those, or more than one of those, that's sort of a point towards being classified as a secularist. Then we have this set of secular beliefs that I alluded to in my remarks. Again, a series of statements in which we ask whether you agree or disagree with them. Each of them is meant to tap into a different aspect that we drew from philosophical writing on secularism, to tap into this idea that people have a worldview that is informed by something other than religion. And then the third thing that we do, the third type of question that we ask, asks people whether or not they derive guidance in their life from non-religious sources. And that's a direct parallel to a very common question that's used to identify religious people in the population, that asks whether or not people are guided in their life by religious sources. And again, I just want to underscore that the way we've set this up, it's possible for you to say that you receive guidance in your life from both sources. You don't have to choose one over the other. And if you sort of think about the way the world works, that makes sense, right? There'd be people who, yes, they derive meaning from the Bible or from another piece of scripture, but that doesn't mean they don't also, draw on whatever their preferred, secular source might be, a particular philosopher, say. So we tally all that together, and we do some statistical mumbo jumbo. But basically, you can sort of think of it as people get a score, and if they score high on our index, then they get classified as a secularist. Hopefully that clarifies at least a little bit of what we are doing here.
Thank you. Did you want anything to that, Rachel?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, as I already mentioned, secularism to me is that high wall of separation of religion and government. But I also realize I haven't defined humanism, which might be helpful, because I do believe that we are well reflected in this book. And humanists, I think, are best described by our slogan, good without a God. That sounds, hokey, but it is how the easiest way to define ourselves briefly. The without a God is obviously what we're not. We do not derive our understanding of the world around us through supernatural means. And for Catholics, we really focus on the profane, right? That what's here, what's now. The good piece is the positivist side of our identity. Humanism is a moral underpinning of how I approach the world and my responsibility to it and to the people in it. So, we have a humanism and its aspirations, which outlines our affirmative statements of how we approach the world. And in it is, I think, ultimately underscored that we believe in the inherent dignity of every human being, and we must work to see that realized in the here and now, because that's all we have available to us.
It's interesting that you should say human dignity, just because it's the Keough School of Global Affairs mission statement. Its orientation is based on integral human development, which is derived from social Catholic teaching, but at its core looks at human flourishing and human dignity. And as Jeff was saying, there are many connections across the board between religions and humanism. Emma, one more question back to you that is reflected in some of the questions I'm seeing coming in here. Is there any hope for this country, I'm really putting the big one on you, to not just keep moving along this fault line that the book illuminates for us? And as David said earlier in this conversation, the trend of people being more driven by their politics than their faiths or their faith or their morals, to me, as somebody who's been in DC and in American politics for a long time, is fairly troubling. It suggests that there are blinders on a lot of Americans that don't even necessarily see individual candidates, they see power. And the only way to get power is for your party to win. And your values, your morals, even your religious underpinnings and beliefs are secondary to your party and winning. The winner takes all, ends justify the means, doesn't matter how we get there. Is that what you see? I'm not asking you to have the evidence-based data that the authors have to their presentation today, but you're out there, you're asking these questions across the board to a lot of Americans, and where do you stand on that perspective? Am I being too pessimistic?
Well, reporters are the worst people to ask about hope. So I'll just put that as my disclaimer. I'm thinking in response to your question about an anecdote that someone who is, ubiquitous in the world of democratic religion and politics writes about in his book, this guy, Michael Ware, who worked in the Obama administration. And he writes in his book about a memo that was drafted up by somebody in, I think, the White House Office of Legislative Affairs, something. And it was talking about a way to frame the Obama administration's economic policies. And the title was, something, economic policies for the least of these. And the staffer got a markup of the draft from their boss that crosses out least of these and says, grammar? Who are these, right? And that's a great example of a translation loss, right? Someone who fundamentally didn't understand, no, that's a Bible reference, right? I didn't just come up with this language on my own. And in fact, Bible references themselves can be really powerful for trying to illuminate wonky politics and wonky policy concepts for people who resonate from a cultural perspective with that framework. So, why did I bring that up? Because it's the opposite of what you're saying. You're asking me for hope, and I'm telling you about translation loss and failure to understand one another. I think we are in a moment of politics, and have been increasingly so, where those translation failures largely characterize our political system, and specifically at the national level, which, as we have seen from the great slides and 2x2 charts, is really defined by the people who are overactive and overrepresented in American politics, which tend to be people who are on the polar ends of the spectrum. Not just polar ends in terms of party affiliation and beliefs, but also in terms of these cultural frameworks we've been talking about. The Democratic National Convention delegates, that to me is such a great illustration. If you look at the RNC and the DNC, the secularists and the religionists are vastly overrepresented. And I think that goes a long way to explain why is it in politics that we constantly feel like we can't understand each other. We can't talk to each other. There is no connection of the framework, no shared interpretation framework for what we should do in our country. So, okay, that's not that hopeful. But I do think that understanding the way in which religion or lack of religion, the way in which secular mindsets or more religious mindsets go into that translation loss, I think it's enormously powerful. So for me as a reporter, again, I shy away from normative questions. I shy away from hopey, changey things of all sorts. But I do think that there's a lot of power in this as an analytic framework. And, if that's maybe short of a sing-song, happiness at the end of the rainbow story, at least it can maybe illuminate and help us understand a little bit better why it seems like we're such in a fractured political moment.
Can I add to that? So I think, yes. So building off of everything Emma just said, I am a person full of hope. I am absolutely bright-eyed and bushy-tailed when it comes to crossing these fault lines. And I think I just want to underscore that absolutely we are activists. We are in the public and political arena. Civic engagement is high. But that doesn't mean we're exclusionary, right? And the Democratic conventions, the high delegate count, I don't think we can read into that just because we're very active and we're present, that we're not inclusive of religious worldviews. I think when we talk about religious freedom in this country, humanists and atheists are among the religious minorities here, and we work in coalition with those groups, going to a point that was previously mentioned. And it's not an accident that the American Humanist Association's Director of Policy and Social Justice is a graduate of Divinity School, right? We recognize that we do this work in coalition, that we do this work with our religious partners, that preserving the secular character of our country is a responsibility of all of us. And I think that's where the hope lies.
Laura, I would also say that the hope lies in universities like ours hosting these kinds of conversations. That we have scholars like these gentlemen.
Do you want to come up to say this?
No, just that we have scholars like these gentlemen, and that we are hosting conversations like this, that our intention is to cross the fault line. Our intention is to elevate the conversation and to invite different partners in and bring the university's strengths to bear on these types of questions.
Perfect.
Amen. I will quickly summarize Dean Mastillo's point, which is absolutely the place where we would like to land this conversation, which is that the University of Notre Dame, I can certainly speak for the Keough School's Washington office, where we are today, but certainly on behalf of Dean Mastillo, Dean Appleby, and many of my colleagues at Notre Dame, and many of the wonderful alumni who I've had a chance to meet, we strive as individuals in collaboration with our scholars to hopefully be an institution and be individuals who can do some of the bridging, who can provide a space for values, no matter what they are or where they come from, to be respected and part of a conversation that does inform politics and policy. That is truly a mission that those of us who are representing the University of Notre Dame here in Washington feel very strongly about. So thank you so much for helping us in that endeavor with today's conversation, and congratulations again on the book to our three authors. And thank you all for joining us today on the webinar and here in the room. Thank you especially to our students and to Ambassador Rooney for his support of the center, and all the work that went into putting this event on today. So thank you very much. Good afternoon.